So this is your introduction to typeface classification. This will be our second and final quiz, the second and final skill that I'm going to test you on. So classification is a process of breaking down all the typefaces in the world, all the typefaces that have ever been designed, into a few general categories. Why? Why do we need to do this? Classification helps us describe and navigate type choices. So type classification helps us to sort type. So scholars, historians, and type manufacturers all need to sort through lots of different typefaces. And it helps us reference type. So educators, students, designers, and scholars all need to be able to refer to different typefaces. Having an agreed-on set of classifications helps both of these processes. This is a very rough estimate, but I think there are about 250,000 digital typefaces available today. So about 250,000 fonts that you could put on your computer and use. Again, very, very rough estimate. I have not found any accounting, and I think it would be almost impossible to get a really accurate number here, but this is a rough estimate. So that's 250,000 fonts. So even with very good search engines, a common system of description is a very big help when you're trying to navigate all these choices. So many systems have been proposed over the years. I'm just going to take you through a few of them just to introduce you to the idea of a classification system. So Francis Didot in 1921, he is French, obviously. This system he proposed is in French. He has he has 11 different classifications. You notice that all except for one, these are all serif typefaces. He just has one category for sans serifs, which is probably a fairly accurate reflection of the world of type in 1921. There were far more serif typefaces out there. Maximilian Vox in 1952, he proposed this system. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different categories. Vox's system was adopted by ATypI, which is the Association Typographic International, which is a European typographic association. They said, yes, Mr. Vox, we like your system. We're going to adopt that as our official classification system. But they added one more category. Let's see, what did they add? Going back one, it looks like they added what they called a fractures system, which we're going to refer to as a black letter. Aldo Novarese in 1964. He was a very interesting type designer, very interesting designer. His typeface stop is used constantly, all the time. You'll see it everywhere in the world around you today, still. And he also designed microgramma and Eurostyle, which are also used constantly in the world today. So look both of those up, Eurostyle and stop. You will have a jolt of recognition for both of them. So anyway, he proposed this system where we classify type entirely dependent on the finishing techniques at the ends of strokes, be they serifs, sans serifs, something else. This is actually a pretty interesting idea. It never really caught on because there are so many different factors in a typeface, but this is an interesting way to break it down. Alexander Lawson in 1966. He is the first American on our list so far. He proposed this system in 1966. So as you can see, he has 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different categories for serif typefaces, 1 category for sans serif. Any and every sans serif will fit into this single category. I think this was a little bit short-sighted of him in 1966. We were already fairly well into the age of the sans serif in 1966. But, you know, we can probably give him a pass then. Now it seems bizarre that all sans serif typefaces would fit into 1 category, and that's because we are well into the age of the sans serif now. This is J. Ben Lieberman, 1967. He published this great book on type, and he went the other direction. Instead of trying to have just a few categories, he has so many different categories here. I really love this because I just love the term the typorama. He's describing all the typefaces in the world as the typorama. It's so 60s. It's so space age. But you'll notice he has 8 main categories, and then under each of those top categories, he has 3 to 6 subcategories, and under each one of those subcategories, he has additional categories. He has something like 50 categories here. This is too complex to be practically useful as an overall organization system. Then Marcel Janco in 1978, he went the other direction. He said there's really only 4 styles of typeface. Lineal, ancient Roman, modern Roman, and Egyptian. These were his 4 styles. So I think these are the 2 ends of the spectrum. Lieberman is being way too complex with his system. Janco is being way too simple. If you start thinking about all the typefaces out there in the world, they can't possibly all fit into one of these 4 categories. Ellen Lupton, author of your book, lists this system in her book. She lists 9 categories. I'm sorry, 7 categories. I can count, really. And this is one of the first systems where you see differences in sans serifs. You'll notice every system up until now that I've shown you only has sans serif as a general category. This one actually proposes 3 different categories of sans serif. And this is a little bit more useful for us in the modern world because we use sans serif type all the time. So the classification system you will learn is a combination of Lawson's and Lupton's systems. I think both of these systems have strengths, both have weaknesses. I've gone and combined them. Before I continue with explaining the system, I do want to make sure you understand there are many, many different systems out there. There is no single right classification system. However, the one I'm going to teach you is relatively simple, 11 categories, and they are all fairly well accepted, commonly used categories. So these are your 11 categories: black letter, old style serif, transitional serif, modern style serif, script, cursive, slab serif, geometric sans, grotesque sans, humanist sans, display, and decorative. I've listed each category in a typeface in that style. That's why I've veered away from my usual minimal approach to these slides, because I wanted to show each category in a typeface of its category. I'm going to explain in greater detail the differences between these as we move on. There are some basic characteristics you need to look out for when you're classifying type. One is stress. This is where the thick and thin parts of the letters fall. The second is serifs, or lack thereof. The individual characteristics of those serifs. And the shape, the general shape of the letters. So let's look at stress for a second. You became intimately familiar with stress in doing your calligraphy project. Stress is where the thinnest parts of a letter fall. So we have a few different types of stress. We have diagonal stress, and this is our old style serif classification has diagonal stress. Your calligraphic letters had diagonal stress. This means that the thinnest parts are not at the exact top and bottom. Then we have vertical stress. This means the thinnest parts of the letter are at the exact top and bottom. If you're thinking of the clock face, diagonal stress could be 11 and 5, could be 10 and 4. Vertical stress is 12 and 6 o'clock, always. There is no stress. Many sans serif typefaces don't have a significant difference in thickness between different parts of the letter. Slab serif styles generally have no stress. Sans serif styles have generally no stress. Now, those of you with a really good eagle eye may be going, well, Professor, that Helvetica O that you're showing me, it looks slightly thinner at the top and bottom than it is at the left and right sides. And you are correct. Generally, to our eye, a horizontal stroke tends to look thicker than a vertical stroke. It's just one of the many tricks that our eyes play on us. So again, type designers make an optical correction, and they make the horizontal strokes slightly thinner. But Helvetica, as in our no stress example, we consider this an unstressed character because the differences between the thick and thin areas are absolutely minimal. They're just optical corrections. If you look at our diagonal stress, our vertical stress, and our horizontal stress, there's a clear, easily identifiable thinner part of each letter. Lastly, on the right, we have horizontal stress, or what we call a reverse stress. This is fairly unusual, and it looks odd to our eyes. This is almost always limited to display and decorative typefaces. Serif types. Bracketed serifs and unbracketed serifs you are already familiar with. Old style serif and transitional serif classifications use bracketed serifs. Unbracketed serifs are our modern style serif. Now there's a third type of serif, and of course you're already familiar with no serif. That's the sans serif. But there's a third type of serif I want to talk about, and that's our slab serif. Now you'll notice I gave you two examples for the slab serif. I gave you Rockwell and Clarendon. So there, Rockwell is an unbracketed slab serif. That's this guy, pardon me. That's this guy, and Clarendon is a bracketed slab serif. So if the bracketing, or lack thereof, doesn't define a slab serif, what does define a slab serif? A slab serif is thick with square ends. A slab serif is as thick as, or almost as thick as, the main strokes of the letter itself. If you look at Rockwell, the serifs appear to be just as thick as the stem of the I. Clarendon, right next to it, the serifs are a little bit thinner than the stem of the I, but they're still significantly thick. Compare them to our bracketed and unbracketed serifs. In both to the left, in both cases, the serifs are significantly thinner than the main stem. All right, so a slab serif is a very thick serif with a square end. It can be bracketed or unbracketed. Shape. This is another area. It especially applies in our system and especially applies to the sans serifs. So our three general shapes will actually look very familiar to you from your skeletal lettering project. Geometric sans serif is based on geometric shapes. And that's our example on the left of Futura. It's based on circles, rectangles, and triangles. Our grotesque in the middle, our example here is Helvetica. A grotesque typeface looks very precisely drawn, and it has uniform symmetrical curves. The curves tend to be the same from the left and the right hand side of the letter. Humanist sans serif on our right, and our example is Gill sans. Humanist sans are based on human writing. They tend to have very asymmetrical curves, meaning the left and right hand sides of curves are generally not the same. They tend to have very open apertures and finials that reach away from the letter, which creates those open apertures. So here are two problem areas. These are two areas where students have difficulty. Stress direction. I want you to remember the clock face when you're looking at stress direction. 12 and 6 o'clock, straight up and down, is a vertical stress. 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, straight horizontal, is horizontal stress. Everything in between there is diagonal stress. And if you'll look at our two hand gloves on the right, where I have indicated the stress direction with the orange arrows, you'll notice on our top example, our old style serif, Caslon, the stress isn't always at the same angle for every curved letter. The A is about the same as the D, but the top loop of the top counter of the G is more up and more vertical. The bottom loop of the G is getting closer to horizontal. The stress of the O is almost straight up and down, but not quite. The stress of the E is far more diagonal. So, and then if you look at Baskerville underneath, this has vertical stress. Every letter has its thinnest parts at the top and the bottom, at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. So the thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't just look at one letter in a typeface when you're trying to identify its stress. Because if you simply looked at the O of the Caslon, you might be tricked into thinking that it was a vertical stress, because it's very close to vertical in the O. You also need to look at the D, the A, the E, the G. A typeface with vertical stress, every curve has its thinnest part at the top and bottom. A typeface with diagonal stress, the angle may change from letter to letter. So look at all of the curved letters overall. Here's another problem area. Students have a lot of trouble identifying the differences between humanist and grotesque. This can be tricky. I want you to do two things when you're looking at these letters. First of all, think of the skeletons. I have shown you the skeletons for our grotesque and our humanist with a thin yellow line here. And think back to your skeletal letters. Which one looks more like the grotesque style? Which one looks more like the humanist style? Sometimes when the letters have a lot of thickness, it can be more difficult to tell. Think about the skeleton. The second, you may be wondering what's going on with this orange and blue psychedelic overlay underneath. This is to help show you when letters are symmetrical or asymmetrical. So in our blue transparent type is right reading, and then our orange, excuse me, our orange transparent type has been flipped so that it's a mirror image. You'll notice in the grotesque that most of the curves line up from left to right. The right reading and the mirror image are the same, and that is because the left and right hand sides of our grotesque typeface are symmetrical. If you look at the same thing in the humanist, almost none of our curves line up left to right. It doesn't happen with the A, it doesn't happen with the C, it does happen with the top of the E, but not with the bottom. All right, and this is because they have asymmetrical curves. Important to keep in mind, as with stress direction, that you need to look at the general trend over the entire typeface. So if you only looked at the top curve of the E in Gill Sans, you might be tricked into thinking they were symmetrical. You need to also look at the finial stroke of the E, the finial strokes of the C, the A. You need to look at all the letters that are in front of you. You'll notice also the grotesque have very closed apertures. They have a narrow opening where there's an aperture. That's in our A, that's in our C, that's in our E. And then our humanist, the apertures are far more open. The finial strokes reach out, whereas the finial strokes in the grotesque reach inwards. All right, so let's go through the individual categories. Black letter. Black letter was developed from handwritten manuscripts of 1400s Germany. These were the actual first metal typefaces that Gutenberg designed. They tend to have very upright calligraphic strokes, and they look very medieval. Black letter is easy to identify because it looks like this. Not many other type styles look like black letter. Old style serif. So this was popular from the 1460s through the 1770s, and it still remains popular. You'll notice I've given you several ways to identify the typeface, but there is one in red, and that is probably your most important area of classification. So the important one is diagonal stress in the round strokes. If it's a serif typeface with diagonal stress in the round strokes, it's an old style serif, according to our system. It also tends to have minimal variation of thick and thins. It generally has smaller serifs, often with concave bases. Generally has a small X height. Often the ascenders are taller than the cap height. Transitional serif. All right, so this is a style that was introduced in the 1780s by John Baskerville, and he designed the Baskerville typeface, which is the first transitional typeface. A transitional serif has vertical stress in the round strokes, and it has bracketed serifs. Okay? Both of these are important to identify it as a transitional. It also often has greater contrast between thick and thins, often has a larger X height, and often the ascenders often match the cap height. Often, but not always. But your two very important ones for transitional are that it's vertical stress in the rounded strokes, bracketed serifs with flat bases. Modern style serif. This was introduced in the 1770s by both Didot and Bodoni. This has vertical stress in the rounded strokes and unbracketed serifs. All right, so both of these are important. Vertical stress, unbracketed serifs. That means that it's a modern style. It also has very extreme contrast between thick and thin, and tends to have a very small X height. Script. Script typefaces are designed to mimic handwritten text, so it looks like fancy handwriting. And it has joined lowercase letters. You'll see that in this example, all of the lowercase letters actually join each other, like someone's script handwriting. There tends to be variations between thicks and thins. There are generally no serifs. Sometimes they're replaced by swashes instead. And it can have a wide variety of X heights. Cursive is also designed to mimic handwritten text, but it has unjoined lowercase. Okay, so this also looks like handwriting, but when you look closely, you notice the letters don't actually join. Other than that, it is very similar to a script. So really, the big difference between script and cursive are whether the lowercase letters are joined. Script, they're joined. Cursive, they're unjoined. Display and decorative. These styles were introduced in the 1800s for the purposes of advertising. They are often whimsical and decorated, and they're usually only legible at large sizes. They can be both serif or sans serif. They can have a wide variation in stroke weight and quality. The stress can be almost anywhere. The big identifying factors for display and decorative type is that they're often very whimsical and decorated, and they're usually only legible at very large sizes. So if you're not sure if something is display and decorative or not, imagine reading an entire magazine article set in that type at 9-point size. If it gives you a headache just thinking about it, that is probably a display and decorative typeface. They're designed only to be legible large. Slab serif. This was also introduced in the early 1800s. These have thick serifs with squared off ends. The serifs are generally nearly as thick as the strokes. Slab serifs may be bracketed or unbracketed. There's generally not a lot of difference between the thick and thin. There's generally a large X height. If there's any stress, it's generally a vertical stress, but it's not necessarily so. So the defining factor, the defining characteristic of slab serif is that it has a very thick serif with a squared off end. And this sample here is a very typical slab serif. It looks much more like a modern sans serif with thick square serif slapped back on it. A geometric sans serif. This is a relatively easy one to identify. It is sans serif, it has no serifs, and the letter shapes are constructed with geometric forms, triangles, circles, squares. Grotesque sans serif. So the grotesque has a very precise mechanical appearance. It tends to look very carefully drawn as opposed to something written. It has uniform symmetrical curves, very little variation of thick and thins, and it tends to have very closed apertures, very narrow apertures. There are two acceptable spellings. Grotesque, ending with a QUE, is more of a English spelling. Grotesque with an ESK at the end is more of a German spelling. Either one of those is acceptable. Humanist sans serif. This is a sans serif with the shape of human writing. So it has very asymmetrical curves. The curves tend to not be the same from the left to right. And it has very open apertures. There can and often are some variation of thick and thin strokes in a humanist, but it isn't necessarily so. I've given you a classification decision guide sheet. You're going to use this for the practice and for the worksheets. So on the page 1, these are all these identifying characteristics of stress direction, serif type, and shape. And then on page 2, I've kind of given you a breakdown, sort of a process to go through to help you classify typefaces. And it's basically you start easy with the ones that are very easy to identify. Is it black letter? Is it display and decorative? If it looks like, does it look like handwriting? If so, is it script or cursive? Then our second general breakdown is it serif? How to tell our 4 different serif types, and then lastly, is it sans serif? How to tell between our 3 different serif, excuse me, sans serif types. Okay, this is all going to lead up to a typeface classification quiz. You should already have type classification worksheet 1 in front of you. The type classification quiz is going to look very much like this worksheet. It's going to be the same format. You're going to get typeface samples. You're going to have to classify them into one of the 11 categories. You'll notice the categories are all listed up at top. And you're going to need to explain why you've chosen that classification. So the classification itself is 2 points. The explanation is 2 points. That means that you could go through the quiz, you can identify every single, excuse me, you can classify every single typeface correctly. If you don't explain your classification, you'd only get 50 points, which is an F. So the classification, the explanation of your choices is incredibly important in the quiz. So it's not just randomly picking. out of these 11 categories, it's not just memorizing, it is understanding the classification. So you must understand the process and explain your thinking in order to do well. So let's practice this. We're going to go through worksheet 1, which has 15 typefaces to classify. If you don't already have it printed out in front of you, please do so. Fill it out along with me as I go through. Number 1, Gaudy text. This is a black letter, and the reason why is because it looks like medieval calligraphy. Black letter is a fairly easy one to classify. Centaur. Centaur is old style. It has diagonal stress and bracketed serifs. In our system, really diagonal stress just right off the bat identifies it as an old style. Bracketed serifs is just another identification method. Number 3, Baskerville. Baskerville is a transitional. It has vertical stress and bracketed serifs. Okay, all of our stress is at 12 and 6 o'clock. Our serifs are bracketed. That makes it a transitional serif. Number 4, Didot. Didot is a modern style. It has vertical stress and unbracketed serifs. All our stress is at 12 and 6. Our serifs are unbracketed. Number 5, Rockwell. This is a slab serif because it has thick square serifs. Okay, you notice our serifs are pretty much the same thickness as all of our stems, all of our main strokes. This makes it a slab serif. Number 6, Snell Roundhand. This is a script. It looks like handwriting. The lowercase is joined. You may notice the uppercase letters are not all joined. The capital R is, but the S and the N are not. It's the lowercase where the lowercase being joined is the identifying characteristic of script. Number 7, Gill Sans. This is a humanist sans serif. It has asymmetrical curves, open apertures, spread finials. It looks like human handwriting. Classic grotesque. This is not a trick question. The name is right there in the name of the typeface. The classification is right there in the name. This is a grotesque sans serif. Now, you can't just, for your reason why, you can't just tell me, well, because it says grotesque. You need to explain, because it has even symmetrical curves. Eagle. This is the lightweight of eagle. Eagle is a geometric sans serif because it's based on geometric shapes. You can see all of our curved letters look very much like perfect circles. It looks like it's made from circles, triangles, and rectangles. This is a geometric sans serif. It's based on geometric shapes. Rosewood. Hopefully it's obvious that rosewood is display and decorative. It is whimsical, it is ornamented, and it is pretty clearly only legible at large sizes. No one would ever use rosewood to set a whole magazine article. Helvetica is a grotesque sans serif. In fact, Helvetica is one of our defining ones. If you look at a typeface and go, does it look like Helvetica? Then yes, that's a grotesque. So your reasoning is because it has even symmetrical curves. Cottonwood. You'll notice the stress on cottonwood is a reverse stress or a horizontal stress. You'll notice how unusual this looks to our eyes. Hopefully this one is obvious too. Cottonwood is display and decorative. It is whimsical, it is ornamented, and again, it would only be legible at large sizes. 13, bell. Bell is a transitional serif. It has vertical stress, and it has bracketed serifs. Number 14, village. Village is an old style. It has diagonal stress and bracketed serifs. And 15, Mrs. Eves. Mrs. Eves has vertical stress and bracketed serifs, making it a transitional serif. Okay, so I want you to classify typefaces 16 to 30 on your own. That's classification worksheet 2. That's your homework. We're going to review it at our next class meeting. And then you'll have another group to do on your own that we will review.